Welcome back, indoor gardeners. Welcome to the Indoor Garden Podcast, yet another episode. I'm your host, Greg Dreiss. Today, we're going to talk about fertilizing indoor plants: when, why, and how. We're going to start off with what's on the package of your fertilizer, whether it's a liquid, a granular, or what have you. You'll see three numbers on the front of the package or the side, and those are N, P, and K: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are the chemical numbers for those on the chart of the elements. And those three that are on the front of the package, those are fertilizers that are needed in large quantities. We're going to start with nitrogen. Nitrogen is mainly responsible for green growth of the plant. The middle number, phosphorus, primary responsibilities include roots and flowering. And the final one, potassium, which is the chemical symbol K, is responsible for cell strength, bright colors, bigger fruits and flowers, and many other things in the plant. Now, the three of them have other duties as well. It's very, very complicated, but for the sense of gardening, and even in my end of the profession, just the basics there is pretty much all you need to know to become more educated and informed on fertilizer and what they do. So a good way to remember what these three things do, the N, P, and K, is a couple rhymes. One I came up with: shoots, roots, and fruits. Shoots being nitrogen, roots, phosphorus, and fruits, the potassium. Or up, down, and all around. Up being nitrogen, down being phosphorus, and all around would be the potassium. Now, we talked about micronutrients. Micronutrients are boron, manganese, sulfur, copper, even chlorine, which are used in very, very tiny, minute quantities, which is as little as either 1/100th or even down to 1/1000th of a percent. Now, they're important in indoor gardening because a lot of the soils that we use indoors are basically inert. For instance, ProMix, before they started putting the beneficial bacterias in it, was inert. It was peat moss, perlite, vermiculite, and a wetting agent. So there was no fertilizer in there and no micronutrients, so nothing to help your plants grow. Outdoors in the soils might be a little less cumbersome or a little less of a deal because a lot of those micronutrients are already there. Now, there's a couple of nutrients that kind of fall in the middle, one of them being calcium. Calcium is sometimes referred to as the fourth macronutrient, but it's not required to be listed as a macronutrient on the package. So what do those numbers mean? Well, let's take a 10-10-10. And that basically, by law, has to be on the package, and that is the percent of that ingredient in the bag, the can, the box, etc., by weight. So if you see a 10-10-10, that means in that bag, if that were a 10-pound bag, there'd be 1 pound of nitrogen, 1 pound of phosphorus, and 1 pound of potassium. And that's what those numbers mean. I saw somebody posting online saying, well, no, those are ratios. Those aren't percentages. No, they're percentages by weight. When they're talking about ratios, for instance, if you see a soil test that comes back and it says, look for a 1-to-1 ratio. Well, a 1-to-1 ratio on those three numbers would be 5-10-5, 10-20-10, etc., like that. So what forms do fertilizers come in? As many as there are colors of the rainbow. General ones are water soluble, and they can be either a crystal that you mix with water, like Miracle Grow, Schultz, etc. They can be a more granular type, and also it's very popular are liquid water solubles. They're already kind of soluble already, but it's a liquid concentrate, so I put them under the water soluble because you do mix them with water. So you've got the granular or the crystal form, and then the liquid concentrates. Straight granular forms are not that common for indoor plant foods. You'll find some on the organic feedings. The organic fertilizers will be in a granular form, and they don't require any mixing. They're already pretty diluted down to what needs to be ready to use on your plants. And a very common one is 5-10-5, and that's pretty much more for outdoor gardening. Now, the other type, or not so much the formulation, but how the fertilizers work, there's slow release, which lasts for months. And if you're using a chemical fertilizer, it's a little tiny, what's called a prill, which is a little piece of fertilizer that's coated with something so that it does not all get dissolved and released right away. And one of the more popular ones on the market is Osmocote. Osmocote reminds me of contact cold medicine, which they used to advertise as tiny time capsules. And if you look into a package of Osmocote, you'll see there are little balls of fertilizer, some very small, some large. In the middle of those balls, there's a little piece of fertilizer that's all the same size. And they're coated in different sizes and different amounts of coating over that so that they feed at different times. The small ones releasing their food, of course, first, and the bigger ones later on. There's fertilizer sticks like Job's. That's the big one out there that you just stick in the plant, and over a period of time through watering and sometimes temperature, they release a certain amount of fertilizer slowly every time you water. And those slow release ones, even the organic ones, can be considered what's called continuous feed, so that you're feeding every time you water. And organic fertilizers are by nature slow release, and they are broken down through water and temperature somewhat, but also through microbes that break down the dried blood, the kelp meal, the bone meal, etc., into usable types of fertilizer for houseplants. Now, they all have their advantages and disadvantages. Water soluble, the advantage is you can change the amount if you want. It's really not recommended. I don't do it, although you will see some people say use the water soluble granulars at half the recommended rate. I don't see any purpose for that unless you're doing a continuous feed, which you can do with a water soluble as well. The disadvantage of any fertilizer that you have to mix with water or put together somehow to apply is you got to remember the last time you did it. So think about all those things you're growing in the garden, and when's the last time you fed your roses? When's the last time you fed your African violets? You can put it on a plant app. You can put it on your phone, might be a little better thing. But the disadvantage also is the changing volume and amounts of nutrients that are in the container. So when you feed it, there's quite a few uh, nutrients in there, but as time goes on for the next 4 weeks or 6 weeks, or your intervals between feeding, there's not much left in the container. Slow release, the advantage is even prolonged feeding every time you water. A lot of professional growers in the greenhouse industry will feed every time they water a very highly diluted amount of fertilizer. So that way there's always enough food in there, and the distance between the stems, what's called the internode, is nice and uniform. That's why professional grown plants look all the same for the most part, because they're fed the same, the mixes are the same, etc. Any disadvantages other than how much you're going to mix up with the granulars or the water solubles? I don't see any disadvantages whatsoever. So now, when to feed houseplants? I feed all year long, and I use a continuous feed. I mix up my own soil, which I add some organic fertilizer to it, but I also use a water soluble. It's just what I do. Everything seems to grow pretty fine and well, and I always like to feed pretty much every time I water, with the exception of about every third or fourth watering. So you just are leaching out or cleaning out the bottom of the pot for any built up water soluble salts that might get there. Common idea online is not to feed plants in winter. I don't understand that. That's been the norm for a long time. There's still a lot of people talking about it. There's a really good plant store nursery up in Latham, Schenectady area, and they've got a sign right there what to do in winter. Don't repot, don't feed, don't do this, don't do that. And I strongly disagree with it, and I'm going to explain why. Well, first of all, very few plants actually go dormant during the winter. There's a few, some bulb plants like that. I think there's a lot of other bulbous or rhizomatous type plants that go dormant somewhat between growth cycles, but that's a plant that pretty much dies back to the top of the pot. I don't have any in my collection that really slow down that much at all. So the only thing they might do because of the differences in light is the growth might slow down, but they're still growing. And as I said, very few, if any, houseplants actually go dormant. And the other thing is winter is outside, not inside. So the argument that it's less light, it's colder. Most people have grow lights today on their plants to keep them growing, and it's 75 degrees or 70 degrees inside your house. Winter is outside, not inside. So um, let's take a look at this whole misunderstanding of light during the winter. Okay, today's February 25th, and I'm just south of Albany, New York. Today the sun rose at 6:39. Tonight it will set at 5:38. Okay, we're still in winter, but that's 11 hours of daylight. That's a lot of light. And the other thing, excuse me, is the days start getting longer on the second day of winter. So the whole premise that the days are shorter in winter really doesn't hold any water, haha, as far as I'm concerned. So it's February 25th. We've got just about 1 month of winter left. So let's jump back to November 25th when there's 1 month of fall left. How much light do you think there is in November 25th? Well, November 25th in Albany, New York, sunrise was 6:58 a.m. and sunset was 4:25 p.m. Okay? That's 9 hours and 27 minutes of daylight. Okay, if you want to throw in the fact that, yeah, okay, maybe the clocks were turned back an hour then, well, it doesn't really make much of a difference because if you turn the clocks back an hour, the sun's going to come up an hour earlier as well as set an hour earlier. So, you see what I'm saying here? February 25th, there's 11 hours of daylight. The days are getting longer every single day, but we're not supposed to fertilize in the winter when the days started getting longer on that second day. Go back to November 25th when there's still a full month of fall left. Daylight was 9 hours and 27 minutes. Okay, 90 minutes less of daylight on November 25th than February 25th, as well as consider the fact that on November 25th and starting the second day of summer, the days are getting shorter. So that's why that whole reason for not feeding is because the days are shorter in the winter. It just doesn't make any sense at all. So we've talked about what the numbers mean, the different formulations, slow feed, long feed, uh, like that. And the next topic I want to talk about briefly is organic versus chemical fertilizers, or as I like to say, regular versus unleaded. Well, when you get to the root of the matter, another bad garden joke there, the plants don't know and the plants don't care. Okay. We're feeding in containers indoors, and there's really no reason to choose organic over chemical or chemical over organic because we're not growing anything outside. It's not something that's gonna get into the ground very quickly or do any damage. And also, what I mean by the plants don't know is the plants have to have whatever you're feeding them broken down to the simplest form for the roots to be able to absorb it. Simple reason is that roots can't chew bone meal, so the phosphorus in the bone meal's got to be broken down to the simplest form, which is that same form or pretty close to it as you find in chemical fertilizers. As well, the disadvantage of the organic fertilizers is there's still a lot of soils out there that don't have any compost in them. They don't have any beneficial bacteria. They don't have the endo and ectobacterias that congregate on the roots, etc., like that. So There's nothing wrong with organic fertilizers for growing indoors, but just keep in mind that you got to have something in the soil that's going to eat and break down those organic ingredients. Like I said, if you're using the old style Pro Mix, which is just peat moss, vermiculite, and perlite, and you throw bone meal, kelp meal, dry fish meal, anything like that, there's not much, if anything, that's going to break it down. So make sure you're using a potting mix that has some organic stuff in it, like already some compost, which a lot of those do now. Or if it has an organic fertilizer already in it, it's going to have some stuff to help break down those nutrients. So let's go back and look at it one more time. Fertilizing indoor plants, you've got those three numbers, N, P, and K, which are macronutrients. And again, those are nutrients that are used in large quantities. Good way to remember them is shoots, roots, and fruits are up, down, and all around, meaning that nitrogen is for the green growth of plants, phosphorus for roots, and potassium for flowering, cell strength, disease resistance. It's like the tough vitamin there. So that's why up, down, all around is a good way to remember what those three nutrients do in that order. Micronutrients you'll find listed on the side of the package in very small amounts, as little as 1/1000th of 1%. The numbers on the package, such as 10, 10, 10, represent percentage by weight of that package, not a ratio, as some are writing in out there in garden land, especially on the Facebook garden groups. And you can choose from a slow release, which means it's going to feed for a longer period of time. Every time you water, you're releasing a certain amount of nutrients back into the soil. It's convenient. It helps make for even growth, and you don't have to remember the last time you fertilized your plants. And again, as I said, I'm a big proponent of feeding year round. Can you get away with not doing it in the winter? Sure. But don't use the reason that plants don't grow in the winter or that plants go dormant in the winter or the light is lower in the winter. Just remember, days start getting longer the second day of winter. They start getting shorter the second day of summer. And today, February 25th in New York, just south of Albany, there's 11 hours of daylight. Jump back to November, there were less than 9.5. You can find the Indoor Gardener podcast on anchor.fm, also on Spotify, and pretty soon Google, Amazon, and all the other podcast platforms, including Stitcher, Pocket Cast, Shoutcast, etc. I'm going to do a bunch of episodes with everything there is to know about indoor gardening. Some of the information we have coming up are propagation, homemade remedies. It's going to be one of my next ones. Do they really work? And what about Epsom salts? We'll talk about organic house plant care in general, not just fertilizing. And we'll look at seed starting pretty soon. We'll talk about hydroponics, the pot's not too big, and also the dirt on dirt. So if you have any information or questions, you can find me on The Indoor Gardener on Facebook. You can find me The Indoor Gardener on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, as well as you can leave questions and answers right here on anchor.fm. The Indoor Gardener is brought to you by Wainwright Broadcasting, who also produces Curmudgeon Radio, the Dive Bar Podcast, as well as the Joe Sixpack Racing Podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you out there in the garden.